able to talk to those in power rationally and explain the situation to them, say, you know, this is climate change, this is what's happening, okay, we have soil erosion, species extinction, and if we were able to really explain this to them, then they would stop doing what they were doing, that they would change their behavior. The problem, of course, is that it ignores the system of social rewards, right? That certain people are benefiting from this destruction. And it's strange, because in the long run, it's obviously in no one's best interest to destroy the land where they live. But today, obviously, the economy rewards that destruction. It filters those people to the top that are willing to embody that ethic, to embody capital. And as long as we're still within that economic system, no amount of rational argumentation will convince these people to stop doing what they're doing. Or let's say you do. You convince some of them to tailor their business practices. What happens? Well, one of two things. First, I'm thinking of Ray Anderson, who was the CEO of Interface Incorporated, a carpet company, and he ends up greening up the business. Well, it's a huge hit, right? And the sales go through the roof. And in the end, he ends up having more environmental destruction tagged to his name, tagged to his company than he did before, regardless of whether he was a leader in green business or not. Okay, there are the other scenario. Someone really goes for the green the whole way, they fall out of the competitive loop, and then someone takes their place. The point is that we live under an earth-destroying economy, and we're nowhere near another one. And maybe we should take a cue here from the Marxists, as they have the best analysis of capitalism. And what do they think of the idea of green capitalism? Or they laugh at it. It's a joke. It makes about as much sense as clean coal. So something has always confused me at the protests that I've gone to. And let me say first, I love protests. I really enjoy them. I go to them. But most protests I've been to, at least politically speaking, in the end, they've been really awful. And what do people say at the end? They say what matters is that we came out here, we made our voices heard, we took the high road, and for that reason we won, we succeeded. And for me, this is a total disconnection from reality. But this shouldn't surprise us, because for liberals, rightness and success, how we measure those things, usually ends up being how well we follow certain abstract moral codes. And that's the mantra, isn't it? We're here to make our voices heard. We want to get our voices out there. And it's always about our voices. But it's strange to me, because the point of our activism is not to make our voices heard. The point of our activism is to win. It's to protect the land. And it's to stop those in power from destroying it. So at no point in the radical approach is the use of violence directly addressed. Now I want to talk about this because, in my experience, violence ends up being something that, environmentalists really get hung up over. Now you might be able to tell that I have a little political crush on the Marxists. If you read Capital, right, it's like 1,200 pages long. There's only one time you see anything close to a discussion of violence, and it's in this little footnote on one page at the bottom. And it says, since the capitalist class will not give up their position, the use of revolution is of course necessary. And that's it. And this was after years of me doing environmental activism, and I'm thinking, oh my God, why is this so easy for them to understand? It's a base assumption for them, and yet it's so hard for us, and ends up taking up so much time of our activist meetings. So for most liberals, violence is always bad, across the board, any situation. On the radical side, what matters with a tactic or an action is not whether it's violent or not, but whether it is forceful or not. And there's a key difference between violence and force. There are plenty of times throughout history where violence has been used very not forcefully, or it's very inappropriate to use, or it's not effective. And there have been plenty of times when nonviolence was the most effective choice that could have been used, and that nonviolence carried a lot of force behind it. And most other social movements haven't had this much trouble with the use of violence or property destruction. You see different parts of these movements working together, even people that have very different ideas. And the classic example here is the Quakers, who although themselves were devout pacifists, they were side by side with gun-carrying abolitionists, right? And their personal views didn't get in the way of that. So that was liberal radical in a really condensed version. And our point here, of course, is that the environmental movement is stuck in the liberal model, and we need to get out of it, or we're going to continue losing. And as we know, losing this is not an option. And there's a certain irony here, me pushing the radical side of change, which is that there's a lot of work to be done that falls within this overlap between liberal and radical. Us in this room, as environmentalists, as animals, there's a lot of personal work we can be doing. We always need to continue distancing ourselves from the insanity of this culture. And we need to figure out what it is in life that we really love. Because for a good friend of mine, what he loves Well, he loves our elk. And for another good friend of mine, what he loves are gray wolf. And for me, when I see deer, I'm always mesmerized. And like when we make eye contact, everything else in my life just fades away. And suddenly it's this relationship, however fleeting that is, that's suddenly all that matters. So we need to figure out what it is in life that we really love. And then we need to figure out if we're willing to give it our lives. And I mean that in every way. So what are we doing as environmentalists, really? My friends and I have come to say that the last thing we need right now is more environmentalists. And it's because of that confusion within the environmental movement, where mainstream environmentalists are some of the first to shout down any discussion of oppositional thinking. And oftentimes they're the ones in the audience that are most resistant to the liberal radical model, where other people who maybe haven't even gotten involved in political work, they get it right away. And sometimes I even hesitate to call it a movement, and I want it to be one. My God, that's what I live for, that's what so many of us live for. But what is a movement? Sidney Tarot is one of the main top social movement theorists. He defines social movements as collective challenges by people with common purposes and sustained interactions with elites, opponents, and authorities. Okay, so there's a lot of information right there. We have collective challenges. So we're doing this together, collectively, obviously, by people with common purposes. This means our goals. What are our goals in this? And in sustained interactions. Okay, this references drawn out periods of tension with those in power. Well, if this is what a social movement is, then I don't see a lot of it going on. I see a bunch of really great people whose hearts are in the right place and they're doing some really amazing work, but they're not being upfront about what it's going to take for us to win this, because it's going to take a lot more than we're seeing right now. And what are we seeing right now? There's really four main areas in environmentalism today. We have the legal approach, we have the direct action approach, we have the technological approach, and then we have straight out withdrawal. So the first, the legal approach. There's some really great things happening, which is what makes this conference so enjoyable, obviously. And it's just being here, it's reminded me, it's so great to work with people that are engaged with the law, because as Catherine McKinnon says, law organizes power. So when you're involved with law, it's very hard to forget about that power that's obviously structuring our social lives. Pardon me. And one project that's pretty under the radar right now, but is really exciting, are the challenges to corporate rule. And some of the most interesting work is being led by CELDIF. That's the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I'm thinking here of New Hampshire, of Maine, of Pennsylvania especially, where over 100 small townships have drafted into law that corporations no longer have legal rights. And what they're doing is really interesting. They'll say, okay, the city of blank no longer recognizes corporations as legitimate entities. They're just cutting it out from the ground. And so lawyers a lot of times will say right away, okay, well the problem is that that's in conflict with state or federal law. Now CELDIF's point is exactly what they're trying to force, and I just love this language, what they're trying to force is a conflict of jurisdiction between local, state, and federal law. They're trying to bring this issue to the fore so it gets more attention. And so far, these 100+ townships have done this. You've seen, the federal government in almost none of the cases have they gone after these small townships, and this has been for years now. So listen to this language. This is from CELDIF's website in their overall strategy briefing. They say, corporations regularly and illegitimately deny the people their inalienable rights, including their most fundamental right to a republican form of government. Such denials are beyond the authority of the corporation to exercise, and such denials are also beyond the authority of the courts or any other branches of government to confer. Okay, to me that's really exciting language. It's powerful language. That's community, right? People that aren't willing to take any more. And that's only a taste of it. So if you haven't heard of CELDIF or read much about them, go check them out because they're very interesting. Okay, then we have my favorite, which is the technological approach. And here we're talking about technological fixes, right? Building solar panels, wind turbines, hybrid cars, CFLs, right? We all know this list. And this approach falls short for a number of reasons. The first is that it doesn't engage the political, right? There's no accounting of who these technologies are going to benefit more. Are they going to benefit me as a white male? Or are they going to benefit poor black communities? Or are they going to benefit corporations more? Like, we're still in the context of capitalism, obviously. So we need to be asking these questions. The other part is that these technologies simply aren't sustainable. And I've heard a lot of environmentalists say that a solar panel has virtually no environmental footprint. Okay, that's bullshit. Where do we get the metals? Where do we get the wiring? Where do we get the rare earth minerals? And how do we refine all of this? Right, this requires an industrial infrastructure. It requires a global economy, global change, or global trade, and in the end, oil. But the most damaging effect of this approach, the techno-fix, is that it allows people to maintain that we can get out of this mess without facing power. And we can't. So instead, we see a lot of people putting so much of their energy into these really tiny projects, so like waste reduction and so on. Never mind that almost all of our per capita waste is produced in industry or away from us directly. And what's really happening here? We have possible political actors, right, social movement actors, who are retreating back into lifestyle choices and then feeling satisfied that this is environmentalism, right, and this is not environmentalism. If you want to do these things, sure, do them by all means, but don't parade them as political choices or environmental solutions. And just think, because it's really simple. If you were a person in a major position of power within this culture, and you had a vested interest in things staying the same as they are now, what would you rather have environmentalists believe? A, that the problem is deeply political and can only be solved with a confrontation with those in power? Or B, that the problem is purely technical and can be solved by simply withdrawing into lifestyle choices within the current coordinates of global capitalism? And in fact, I'm tempted to say that this might be the best way to judge any environmental strategy, is by asking, how does this look to those in power? If it doesn't threaten the current distribution of power, then it's probably not effective. And as a strategy, it should be abandoned. So the last approach, withdrawal. The basic idea is that we need to step away. Things are very obviously messed up in this culture, and we need to build this alternative way of life, and then maybe we can lead by example. Well, this really sounds nice, especially for those of us who, understandably, don't like this culture. But again, the risk is that we fail to make that first political step. We don't acknowledge that there are people who have no regard for other people's ways of life, and they will take that land, they'll take what's not theirs if they need to. And that's happened before, that's happening now, and that will continue to happen in the future until they're stopped. And that's always my question for the permaculture people, is what do you think the government will do when they need fertile land and you're the one sitting on it? And maybe we could ask an indigenous person. And I'm here fully as a huge supporter of permaculture, because they're going to be feeding us all. Well, maybe not me after that comment, but they'll be feeding you all. But the point is it has to fit back into a larger movement. And that's true with any approach. And that's probably the take home from today. It has to tie itself back into a larger movement. And that's when we'll see the strengths of each of these movements really coming to the fore. All right, so I've just gone into the basics of liberal radical and kind of where we're seeing in the environmental movement today. And I'm going to pass over to Lierre, and she's going to go into more of how an effective social movement will actually look. And to do this, first let me introduce Lierre Keith. Lierre Keith is a writer and radical and feminist activist. She's the author of The Vegetarian Myth, Food, Justice, and Sustainability, which one reviewer called the most important ecological book of this generation. She's the co-author of Deep Green Resistance, Strategy to Save the Planet, along with Derek Jensen and Eric McVeigh. And Deep Green Resistance has finally won the approval of the lawyers and will now be available next month. So please help me welcome Lierre Keith.
Well, you've heard of speed dating, so I call this speed revolution. So the first question, is civilization a war against the living world? And next, is that war real or is it a metaphor? Because there's a whole bunch of people who would say, not only is that a metaphor, it's a really bad metaphor. There's no enemy. There's no us and them. There's just well-meaning, if wounded, people. That actually cuts to the main division between the radical and liberal perspectives, as Cameron has already addressed. But power is not a mistake, out of which the powerful can be educated.